You can be an optimist who's hopeless. I think things are going to be okay, thank God, because there's nothing I can do. Hope actually is tied to happiness. Optimism generally is not. Optimism is something, it's just kind of a sunny predictor. You might be an optimist because you're a happy person, but the optimism itself doesn't make you happier.
Let's talk about the difference between optimism and hope. You comment on this.
People use them interchangeably. There's so much, empathy and compassion. It's like they're not the same. These things are never the same. One of the things I do in my classes, I always have a distinction between two things that seem the same, and then see what the distinction will actually do for our lives if we understand them. And optimism and hope it's a classic case. Optimism is nothing more than a prediction. Things will be okay. It'll be okay. Everything's going to be all right. Maybe yes, maybe not. Hope is no matter what happens, I can do something. Something can be done, and I can do something about it. Hope is empowering. You can be a very pessimistic but very hopeful person. You can be an optimist who's hopeless. I think things are going to be okay, thank God, because there's nothing I can do. Hope actually is tied to happiness. Optimism generally is not. Optimism is something, it's just kind of a sunny predictor. You might be an optimist because you're a happy person, but the optimism itself doesn't make you happier.
What is the opposite of hope? Despair?
Is despair, is hopelessness. You should be hopeless about it, to say there's nothing I can do. Nothing can be done, and there's nothing I can do, right? That's almost never true.
And what is the root of that feeling or belief system?
Despair usually is an extreme form of disempowerment. And, people get it from childhood trauma. I mean, there's some research that suggests that the way that people are brought up can make them inherently hopeless. But people actually can get into kind of a hopeless stance. And part of it is self-definition. For example, we have a real tendency in our culture to want people to live on the basis of victimhood and grievance. People will actually, their identity will be victim. I'm a victim. And their identity will be grievance against the people who have power over me. And I get it. I mean, there are people who have power over us. And there's legitimate grievance. And people are victims. But to identify as a victim is the recipe for hopelessness and despair.
And why is that becoming more prevalent? Or does it just seem that way?
Well, it goes in waves. And what happens is we have an identity culture at this point. And one of the things that you typically find is that especially manipulative leaders will tell people that they can be virtuous on the basis of victimhood. That victimhood is inherently virtuous. That's called, literally in the social science literature, it's called virtuous victimhood. And it's incredibly disempowering for the followers. It's incredibly manipulative and malignant on the part of leaders who are actually doing this. And we're in a period in our culture of polarization and hatred and contempt where there's just a lot of that going around.
And it seems that both sides have agency in this, just different flavors of it.
Oh, totally. Oh, totally. You look at the most manipulative leaders, and these manipulative leaders, they have the characteristic almost always of what we call the dark triad of personality, which is a combination of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. That happens in 7% of the population, according to Scott Barry Kaufman, who's done the best work on the dark triad. So that means trait psychopathy. It doesn't mean you're an axe murderer. It means you're way less remorseful about your negative actions than people in the population. If you're narcissistic, Machiavellianism, and have trait psychopathy or dark triad, you're most likely going to want to disempower people, create a movement of people who are relatively disempowered because you want to manipulate people.
And do we see that more concentrated in politics?
Yes, right now in particular. So what politics does this where we reward dark triads. And what we're doing is we're rewarding dark triads on both sides of the political spectrum right now. So it's a war of dark triads. And their followers are being systematically disempowered into a climate of virtuous victimhood. That's what we actually see. What's the source of my virtue? The fact that I'm getting screwed is the source of my virtue. That's okay. I mean, agree or disagree that that's a hell of a way to run a country, right? But for sure, this is why happiness is in decline.